Now that Castro was feeling really intimidated by the United States and threatened by the United States and has reached out to Khrushchev, this sets the stage for the Cuban Missile Crisis. Probably one of the most frightening 13 days in United States history, where we literally were right on the brink of nuclear war, and at any point somebody who'd been delegated the authority could have made a decision to spark a global World War III. So, Cuban Missile Crisis. Castro had a powerful ally in Moscow. The Soviet premier, Nikita Khrushchev, promised to defend Cuba with Soviet arms. During the summer of 1962, the flow to Cuba of Soviet weapons, including nuclear missiles, increased greatly. Now, to be fair to Nikita Khrushchev, the United States had weapons near the Soviet borders in places like Turkey, other places around Europe, pointed at the Soviet Union, and I think the Soviets felt like this was just kind of fair game to do the same thing, but the United States was unaccustomed to having their soil threatened and hadn't through world wars, and so this was a big deal to the United States. During the summer of 1962, Kennedy responded to the warnings that America would not tolerate offensive nuclear weapons in Cuba, and on October 14th, photographs taken by American planes, specifically U-2 spy planes, revealed that Soviet missile bases in Cuba, some contained missiles that were ready to launch or almost ready to launch. These missiles, our intelligence knew that they would be able to reach the United States cities, many major cities, in just minutes. On October 22nd, Kennedy informed an anxious nation of the existence of those Soviet missile sites in Cuba and of his plans to remove them. He made it clear that any missile attack from Cuba would trigger an all-out attack on the Soviet Union. So these missile complexes in Cuba were located 1,020 miles from this Havana site right here to Houston. About 1,898 miles to Denver. About 837 miles to Atlanta. Just over 1,500 miles to Chicago. About 1,300 to Washington, D.C., and about 1,430 to New York. The United States, if you remember from leftover from the Spanish-American War, has this base in Guantanamo Bay. And literally, these time frames are minutes.
An even more direct threat to American security began to unfold on October the 14th, 1962, when American U-2 surveillance planes flying over Cuba made a discovery.
It was unbelievable. I couldn't believe that the Soviets would introduce nuclear-tipped missiles into Cuba, targeted on the eastern part of the United States. They never had moved nuclear weapons off the soil of the Soviet Union. We didn't believe they would. They did.
It was my father's decision and his own idea. It was only one reason: to show that we are great power and we will protect all our allies, and if anybody will try to fight against our allies, that will mean the beginning of the Third World War.
The Cuban Missile Crisis would last for 13 days that October. The president and his most trusted advisors tried to figure out how to get Khrushchev to remove the missiles from Cuba.
As far as the president was concerned, this was a superpower confrontation. And
was the Soviets who put nuclear missiles in Cuba. It was the Soviets who would have to remove them.
It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response from the Soviet Union.
So for the next 6 days, the world faced this really terrifying possibility that we would have to experience nuclear war. In the Atlantic Ocean, Soviet ships, presumably carrying more missiles, headed toward Cuba, while the United States Navy prepared to quarantine Cuba and prevent the ships from coming within 500 miles of it. In Florida, 100,000 troops waited, the largest invasion force ever assembled in the United States. C. Douglas Dillon, Kennedy's Secretary of the Treasury and the veteran of nuclear diplomacy, recalled those tension-filled days in October. He said, "The only time I felt fear of nuclear war or the use of nuclear weapons was on the very first day, when we decided that we had to do whatever was necessary to get the missiles out. There was always some background fear of what would eventually happen, and I think this is what was expressed when people said that they feared they would never see another Saturday." The first break in the crisis occurred when the Soviet ships stopped suddenly to avoid the confrontation at sea. Secretary of State Dean Rusk said, "We're eyeball to eyeball," and the other fellow just blinked. A few days later, Khrushchev offered to remove the missiles in return for an American pledge not to invade Cuba. The United States also secretly agreed to remove missiles from Turkey. The leaders agreed and the crisis ended. "For a moment the world had stood still," Robert Kennedy wrote years later, "and now it was going around again." Kennedy and Khrushchev really took heat for this. The crisis severely damaged Khrushchev's prestige in the Soviet Union and the world. Kennedy did not escape criticism either. Some people criticized Kennedy for practicing brinkmanship when private talks might have resolved the crisis without the threat of nuclear war. Others believed he'd passed up an ideal chance to invade Cuba and oust Castro. It was learned in the 1990s that the CIA had underestimated the number of Soviet troops and nuclear weapons that were on the island. It was actually there were even more. The effects of the crisis lasted long after the missiles had been removed. Many Cuban exiles blamed the Democrats for losing Cuba, a charge that Kennedy had earlier leveled at the Republican Party, and switched their allegiance to the Grand Old Party or the Republicans. Meanwhile, Castro closed Cuba's doors to the exiles in November of 1962 by banning all flights to and from Miami. 3 years later, hundreds of thousands of people took advantage of an agreement that allowed Cubans to join relatives in the United States. By the time Castro sharply cut down on exit permits in 1973, the Cuban population in Miami had increased to about 300,000. To this day, there's still a difficult relationship with Cuba based upon this experience right here.
The U.S. military was put on the maximum level of alert, DEFCON 2. The president ordered the Navy to mount a blockade around Cuba.
All ships of any kind bound to Cuba, from whatever nation or port, where they found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back. This quarantine will be extended if needed to other types of cargo and carriers.
For 72 hours, the world watched and waited as Soviet ships approached the quarantine line.
They kept coming, so there would be days of incredible tension. Millions of Americans believed that they were about to go. We literally sat and talked about the fact that we were living there out in the wilds of New Jersey, and were we far away from New York City? I was at NYU at the time. And the professor was sitting there. I looked up at the clock in the morning and goes,
deep breath.
And then the Soviet premier ordered his ships to turn back. In the end, the Soviet leader agreed to withdraw the missiles in return for a U.S. pledge not to invade Cuba.
There's going to be any learning curve. If you make a mistake with respect to a decision in years and you're going to destroy nations. Both Russia and Kennedy realized how close they'd come. And they were determined to avoid that in the future.